Right. Thank you everybody for being here. Welcome to the conference. Welcome to a talk that I called Optimize Your Way to RCE with Chakra. A few words about me. So my name is Bruno. I'm 25, French, graduated right next door, as Florence said. I do independent security research. Been doing that for about 2 years, a year and a half. I'm a team member of GreHack. Maybe you followed our work that we published. I did a few hacking contests such as Spawn to Own and Hack to Win. Made it to the MSRC Most Valuable Researcher list this year, and also team member of the Sleep on Repeat CTF team, with which I ran a few CTFs at CCC and did a few DEF CON finals. So the purpose of the talk today, it's not going to be focused on the inner workings of JavaScript engines, because I presented about that already, but I wanted it to be focused on an attacker's point of view, and try to give a feeling as offensive security researchers what we need to do these days to compromise what can be objectively seen as a hard target. So the agenda for today, we'll start with the attacker's perspective, so kind of a soft introduction to like offensive researcher mindset. Then we'll do a bug analysis of a bug I found. Then it will be the lengthy part of the talk, which is the exploitation journey. So it's going to be heavily focused on the exploitation part today. And then we'll finish by the defender's perspective, talk a bit about that, and then we'll have a short conclusion. So the attacker's perspective, so the start of our journey, basically we set out with one goal, which is we want to compromise Microsoft Edge, which is the default browser on Windows 10 today. And there are two main components basically to succeed in this quest. First of all, we need remote code execution in the renderer process, so the process that's responsible for, like your web page. And then you need either a sandbox escape or go directly into the kernel. And today we'll be strictly focusing on the RCE part. So now the question is, where do we start with this? And there are a lot of attack surfaces in modern browsers. So you have the DOM, JavaScript engine, the networking layers, the graphics processing, etc., etc. And the question that we can ask ourselves is, which one are we going to choose from in order to try to attack this particular target? So with that comes the next questions. The next question, which is, how do we choose? So I listed a few of, I think, criteria that we can think about in order to select a particular attack surface, whether the component is open sourced versus closed sourced. Is it something that's heavily scrutinized or something that's more obscure? Ease of exploitation as well. What I mean by that is here we're trying to do a full chain, so showing that there's a bug and then not being able to do anything with it is not really something that interests us. We want to chain that with another bug to continue the compromise of the target. And finally, maybe the criteria that actually trumps everything that I said before, which is play into your own strength. So basically what you are already good at. And so for this talk, of course, we're going to be talking about JavaScript engine, which is called Chakra in Edge, and we'll be focusing on that from now on. So why choosing the JavaScript engine? A few things for which I think it's a good target. First of all, it's open sourced. Ease of exploitation as well. The fact that you have access to what is effectively a scripting language makes it super easy and nice to chain that with another bug. Also happens to be my focus, but you have a very big drawback, which is that it's super heavily scrutinized. So you're going to be competing with a lot of people. Next question, of course, that I wish there was like a known answer for how to find a bug. For the purpose of this talk, I believe that we can do the following split in terms of trying to explain what kind of bugs we're looking at. First of all, variants, and second of all, brand new type of bugs. And one thing I really want to highlight is that by new, I'm talking, of course, here about the public perception, because you never know what's going on in the offensive market. But yeah. So the first one, variant analysis, what is it? What it is, you take a public bug report, coming maybe from Project Zero, Chinese teams that publishes something, whatever. You understand the root cause, and you try to find similar types of bugs, so variants of it. A couple of good things. You have less overall knowledge that's required, because in the end you only need to understand what's the bug at play and the components that it affects. It's also very much easier to audit when you know what you're looking for. And I cannot stress this enough. When you're auditing something that's like 400,000 lines of code, knowing what to look for is a big part of it. And maybe it's also easy to exploit. And by that I mean, if in the original bug report there's an exploit for it already, maybe all you need to do is kind of copy paste around the trigger for the variant, but maybe, like 80% of the work is already done there. Two main drawbacks to that. Half the planet is doing exactly that as we speak. And bug collisions are a real thing. So just to give a bit of context, when we prepared Pontoon with Niklas, we started in January for the contest that was in March. We had 3 remote code execution. All of them ended up being dead before the contest because we were finding variants basically. The next one, finding new class of bugs, no known recipe. But from my experience, you have one broad requirement, which is you need to have deep knowledge of the target as a whole. And usually what's funny is you get an idea when not working. So for me, going to the post office seems to work wonders. For QWERTY, for example, losing your passport also seems to work for him as well. Maybe that's why he loses it so many times. But yeah. The main upside to finding a new class of bug is that it has a much higher life expectancy. But you have a lot of drawbacks that come with that. First of all, you don't really know what you're looking for because, I'm looking for a new class of bug. Okay, you don't know what it is. So it's really hard to target your auditing. You're going to be doing a lot of mindless reading of code. You also have the requirement to know the target as a whole. And once again, we're talking about a very complex target. So, acquiring that knowledge takes a long time. And exploitation can either be super easy, insanely hard, or somewhere in the middle, and you have no way to find that until you actually find that new class of bugs. And sometimes it takes like 3 full weeks, 16 hours a day to turn a bug into an RCE. Sometimes it takes 2 hours, so you never know. So yeah, so the story for this talk, basically, we're going to be looking at a bug I found, which was not a variant of anything in Chakra. We're going to be understanding the very limited primitive that we get, and then I'll be working through my process to exploit it and turn it into a very reliable remote code execution. So, bug analysis. So, we'll start with 4 or 5 slides about JavaScript engine still to make sure everyone is kind of on the same page. So JavaScript engine 101, what is a JavaScript engine? It's basically the component of the web browser that passes the JavaScript code and executes it. And you have 2 main modes of execution. You have the interpreted mode, and then you have the just-in-time compiled. Now, what is JIT compilation? So it's basically JavaScript engines these days, so like the 4 main ones, they all come with like optimizing compilers, where the goal is basically to make the code run at near native speed. The problem, of course, is you don't have any kind of type information in JavaScript, so how are you going to optimize your code? The solution to that is called speculative optimization, which I've talked about at length at OffensiveCon and Blue Hat in Israel this year. I have a link to that presentation, so I'm not going to be talking about that today. But if you're interested, I recommend checking it out, and there's also a few resources available online. The main object that we have in JavaScript object called JS objects. So if you take an object in JavaScript, it's basically a simple dictionary of key value pairs that we call properties. And the interesting thing to note is that in all the engines this apply, each object does not maintain its own hash map of property names to property values. They only have like one buffer of property values, and they have an outside structure that basically describes what is this object's layout, that basically say property A is at index 0 in that buffer, etc., etc. And JavaScript does not limit the number of properties you can add to an object, at least in theory. So in Chakra, that's what it looks like in memory. We have an object A, assign 2 properties to it, X and Y. And if we look at the memory layout of that object, we have this thing. So the first thing is the virtual table pointer. Then we have the type. And then we have this field called oxlot, which basically is a pointer to a contiguous memory region that contains the property value. Of course, that buffer is allocated with a certain capacity. So the question is, what happens when the buffer is full? So, of course, as I said, we do not have a limit in terms of the numbers of properties we can add to an object. So at some point, we add properties, so we have the same object, and assume the buffer is full, and we add property Z, and now the buffer is full, so we need to grow the backing buffer. So nothing crazy happening here. Basically, what it looks like, we reallocate the backing store, this time growing the capacity, so we pre-allocate a buffer with like a much bigger capacity. We're going to be copying the previous values over, fixing the pointer to make it point to the new memory buffer, and then finally we assign the property. And the previous buffer now is ready to be garbage collected, so these things, they happen without you knowing about it, and you should not know about it. But yeah, that's basically how it looks like. Now the question is, what about the JIT? So the JIT also needs to account for these growing stores. The way they do that is, in Chakra, is they use a call into the runtime. So basically the JIT generated code will call into the engine itself to grow the buffer. But the main thing to know is basically the JIT code itself is responsible for reloading pointers. So we'll be looking at an example of what I mean with that. So we have this piece of JavaScript code, and we have this function opt, and we give it an object, and we assign property A and B. So nothing crazy here. Then we have function make, where we create an object, and assign X number of properties to it. And basically we see that we call opt with that object we created 1,000 times, which will trigger JIT compilation, so the optimization. So the JIT compiler will first create an intermediate representation of that particular function, opt, and if we look at it very simplified in Chakra, we see that the first property addition of A is represented by a store field instruction, and the property addition of B, again, represented by a store field instruction, but we have this instruction in between, which is adjust obj type reload aux slot pointer. So the Chakra team really likes acronyms, so the instructions sometimes are a bit unreadable, but we see that there's this call into the runtime, and we call it with the object. And that is what is responsible for reallocating the property buffer and growing the property buffer, copying the values over, and so forth. So lowering, which is basically the step where you go from the intermediate representation, which is machine independent, to something that's actually machine dependent. So here we're going to be using something that looks closely to x64. And if we look at the lowering of that, again, very simplified, we have the first instruction. What we do is we load the aux slots pointer into register, and then we use relative indexing to set the property value where A is supposed to be. Then we call into the runtime to grow the property buffer because it's full. And now we do the second property addition, and here we see that we reload the aux slots pointer because it has changed before, it has been reallocated, and we do the same thing, relative indexing into memory to assign a new property. Now the question is, what if this instruction that's supposed to be loading the aux slots pointer into R0, the second one, is not actually emitted for whatever reason? Well, if we look a bit at, we'll see that R0 basically still holds the previous value of the buffer that was full, and we are going to be using that to actually set a property, which means that effectively we'll be writing one property off by one inside the buffer. So the buffer was full, and we're going to be writing one quad word right past it, because we have not reloaded the new value. So quickly, optimizations do go wrong. Sometimes the dev teams will try to improve the speed of the JIT compiler. Chakra team tried to improve the whole adjusting the property buffer logic in that particular commit here, and they basically introduced the same that exact situation that I described, where the property buffer is not reloaded after having been grown. And if you're interested in the root cause, I won't be talking about it here today, but I have a blog post about it that you can look at. Which takes us to the exploitation journey. So let's write down the goal. We want to compromise the target. What that means, remote code execution. And the initial primitive we get is we write one JS value off by one out of bounds. So we'll be looking a bit at what happens here. So here I have the function, the trigger for the bug, kind of similar to what we look at. To what we looked at already. We have a function, make obj, creates an object with 20 properties, and the function opt creates a new property called pawn and assigns A1, which is a property that exists already. We can see it in make object. And we call that function repeatedly to trigger JIT compilation. So let's walk through it. So we create an object, as I said, 20 properties. That's a value at which the property buffer is full. And then we call this thing, which, since the property buffer is full, the first thing it will do, it will actually reallocate the buffer. So now we can see that aux slots has changed, it points to somewhere else, and here we're looking at the old property buffer, which is full. And when we do the assignment, the property buffer is not reloaded, so we're going to be writing value, which is whatever we assign to A1. We are going to be writing that relative to the old buffer out of bounds. So we're going to be overwriting the first 8 bytes right after our property buffer, and we don't know what memory it is. So first set of limitations that we have, we can only write a JS value. So if you look back at the slides, we assign A1, and basically the value of A1 is effectively what we will be writing in memory out of bounds. So we can only write JavaScript values, which means that in Chakra they are tagged. So they use the fact that you have like 17 bits that you can use to encode type information, 18 bits, sorry. So if you take the integer 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in hexadecimal, it's actually encoded as this thing on the right, where we can see that the upper bits are set to 1 in red. If we take the float, that's x41414141, we can see that there's this tag FFFC. And objects are actually simply represented as a pointer, so if we assign an object, we'll be basically writing their pointer value, which we don't know because of ASLR. So, and also we can only write the very first quad word past our buffer. There's no way around that. We cannot write, 2, 3 keywords further, only the very first keyword. So, next question, what to overwrite? So two things to consider. We want to find a target that gives us a better primitive when overwritten, because right now we can only write one value out of bounds. It's pretty limited. We're not going to be, well, we're going to be able to compromise the thing, but we need to improve our primitives in order to gain more and more control about what we're doing. And that particular target that's going to allow us to do that, we need to be able to place it reliably past the buffer, because remember, we don't control the allocator ourselves in JavaScript, so we need to make sure that whatever we want to overwrite, we actually place it right after the buffer that's full. So finding a target, the first idea I had, JavaScript objects, I tried to be smart, see if I could get a code execution directly. So the first quad word is the vtable pointer, so if we override that, technically we can control the register, the instruction pointer register. Managed to get that working as a POC in Chakra core, but in Edge you have something that's called control flow guard, which basically guards indirect calls. So without any info leak, we're not going to go anywhere. So you can show that you control RIP on Chakra core, but that's it. So won't work. Put the idea aside really quickly. And yeah, that's it. So what next? We need to look at other classes, structures, and what the first keyword is. How you're going to do that for something that's like, as big as a JavaScript engine. I believe the correct way to do that is like a compiler plugin that allows you to dump the structure and query what the first keyword is. Otherwise, you're going to be reading a lot of source code, or maybe you've been looking at Chakra for the past 2 years, so you already know the target, so you kind of have an idea of maybe what can be interesting. What are we trying to do? Why are we doing that? We want to turn a very limited primitive into a better one. And the current goal, we want to achieve RCE, and in a JavaScript engine that basically, or any target basically means achieving read-write primitives first. So we're going to be trying to turn a very limited primitive into an arbitrary read-write. Which brings us to our first intermezzo, talking about arrays. So what's an array in JavaScript? It's basically standard defined as a regular JavaScript object with one special property called length, which has a special meaning in how the array behaves. So most engines, they implement basic but efficient optimizations for arrays internally, and in Chakra they use segment-based implementation. So what I mean by that, here I have an array, I declare it with like 3 scalar values, and that's the segment that's representing that particular array, where we have left, which is 0, because that's the leftmost index. We have length, which is 3, because we assigned up to index 2. So length is always the highest index you assign plus 1. Size, which is the capacity of the segment. And next, which is supposed to be a pointer, here it's 0. Now I assign index 100, and we want to keep using, a contiguous memory region for arrays to be fast. But here, by assigning index 100, the question is, do I actually allocate 100 times the size of what I'm storing to store effectively 4 values? The answer is no. We want to save memory. So they use a segment where basically here they create a new segment, which is left is now 100, which is the index we're assigning. Length is 1, and size is 18. It's the size it's pre-allocated with. And now when we assign index 101, we can see that only length has changed, and we wrote the value 5 on that segment we just allocated. So back to finding a target. As you could guess, segment look pretty interesting. The first quad word of the segment, they have basically 2 fields. First one is left, which is the leftmost index of the segment. And then we have the length of the segment. What this means is that overwriting the first keyword of a segment, we're basically able to overwrite these 2 fields. It also has 2 added benefits as a target that we want to overwrite. we can use the fact that we have a tagged value to our advantage, because we'll be able to use the tag to overwrite, to control the value that ends up in one of the fields. And also we can overwrite an index. When we overwrite left, we effectively overwrite an index, which means that it's observable in our exploit code. So we'll be able to basically test if our bug worked. So placing, now the second thing I talked about, we have this array segment, looks super interesting to place in memory and to overwrite. The question is, can we actually effectively place it where we want it to be so that we overwrite the first field? If we're not able to do that, effectively we're not really making any progress. And we also have to keep in mind that no matter what, the value will be written out of bounds. So if we don't control what's overwritten, then we might overwrite whatever and then just crash the engine altogether, which is something we want to avoid. And for that, we have to understand how allocations work inside the engine. So we were talking about the allocator very quickly. So JavaScript, of course, is garbage collected. And for it to be garbage collected, allocation in Chakra happened through what they call the recycler. And it's a bucket-based allocator. So it's kind of similar to GmalloC in that sense, where you have ranges of memory that are reserved for objects of the same rounded up size. So basically what that means is that objects of the same size will basically be together. And two objects of two different sizes, like very, very hard to get them next to each other, almost impossible. Question is, can we make an array segment and property buffer fall into the same bucket? The answer to that, of course, is yes. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here presenting yes. So heap feng shui. So segments, they're created with a fixed size when we create them, which is 18, as we saw in the previous slide, which means that initially we don't control their bucket, but we control the number of properties that we set on an object. So we have a way to control, to have some kind of control over the bucket in which the property buffer will fall. So we just need to find a number of properties for which the property buffer will fall in the same bucket as the array segment, and also the number for which the property buffer is full. So that particular number happens to be 20, which is the example I have. So now I have the trigger. As you can see, opt and make opt, they haven't changed, except A1 I have 4,000. We'll look in a bit. And in the loop now, I do a few more things. So first off, we can see that there's this call to make object. I create my object. Then in an array I previously created in the loop, I assign this index 1000 in hex, which, as we can look, there's no index near that has been set, so it will create the segment creation. By doing that, right after I've created the object, I'm basically banking on the fact that most likely the allocator will just have bumped the memory pointer for that particular range, so allocate it right after it. So here we end up with what we wanted. We have the property buffer, and right after it, there's the array segment. And now I trigger the bug. So I do the assignment, and now we assign whatever is in A1, which is 4,000 here. So remember, values are tagged, which means that now we end up with left being 4,000 and length being effectively 10,000, because it's the high 32 bits that contains the tag. And now the cool thing I talked about is that if you look at the array, how it's created in the loop, we create an array, we assign index 1000 and then index 7000. So index 4000 should never be set. But if we actually trigger the overwrite, we actually overwrote the index of the segment, and now we can test for it. So here you can see that at index 1000, I assign the value 1337.36. And now I test that index 4000 is actually this value, which if there was no bug, it should never be the case. But if actually we succeeded, that means we know that the buffer was overwritten, the segment was overwritten as we wanted. And now we basically have an array where we can access the segment out of bounds. So we are done now, right? Well, sorry for you if you don't enjoy exploitation, but we are absolutely not done. What we effectively managed to do with all of that jazz is we turned an off by one into a better out-of-bound access, so relative out-of-bound access, where we have more control and more access to memory. So we still have quite a few things to do. So intermezzo number 2 about arrays. So as I said, all the engines implement simple but very efficient optimizations to array. In Chakra, they basically have 3 types of arrays, which are JavaScript native int array, JavaScript native float array, and JavaScript array. So what it is, we'll look at it. So here I create an array with 1 and 2, which means it will start with the most optimized type, which is native int array, which means that it stores 32-bit integers. Integers are unboxed in the memory, in the segment, and they are stored on 4 bytes. Now, at index 0, I assign a float. So, which means that A now needs to be transitioned to a native float array. The doubles now are stored still unboxed, but now each element takes 8 bytes. So we take twice as much in memory. And now I assign an array to index 0 and we transition to the most generic type of array. And now the values are boxed, which means that objects, their pointers will be stored, and for integers or doubles, we'll have their value XORed with their particular tag. So 2.0 float tag, which is FFFC in the upper bits, and 1 for integers. Now the thing is, if we are accessing out of bound of a float array, then for the engine itself, all the values that we'll be looking at or accessing are supposed to be unboxed double numbers. Which means that if we read out of bounds a pointer, then the engine will treat that as a float. So here we basically have a vector of attack to get an info leak by basically trying to read the pointer as a double value and getting that value back. And we'll be able to do it the other way around as well, accessing from an object array into that, and we'll be using that now to continue compromising the target. So the strategy, going back to the presentation I gave at the STIC this year, the standard approach to get read-write primitives, you have to build two primitives, which are address of, which gets you the address of any object, and fake obj, which basically, given an address, gets you a handle to that address as if it was a JavaScript object. It was popularized by Samuel in his first FRAC article, and once you have these two primitives, basically, in all the engines these days, I believe there are generic way to derive read-write primitives, which is what I presented as STIC. So let's assume we manage to do address of and fake obj, then all we need to do is copy-paste from what I presented as STIC already, and we'll have read-write primitives. And basically now, what we're going to see is how we're going to derive address of and fake obj from a newly acquired primitive. So the address of primitive, let's formalize a bit. Basically, given an object O, address of O basically should return to you the object's address as a number. So the idea that we're going to use here is that we're going to be using our bug, which allows us to access from an array out of bounds. So we're going to be accessing out of bounds from a float array, read memory, and try to read an object in a controlled way so we are able to reliably get its address. So basically what we're going to do is read the pointer value as a double. And here I have the code for that. Hope you can see in the back, but I'll walk you through it. Here on the right, we use our trigger. It's very similar to the one I had before. Actually, it's the same. We call the function the buggy function, and by overwriting the left field, we have a way to know whether the corruption worked or not. So if we take the break of the if statement, we know it worked. And now I create a second array with my object, make its index start at 1337. The reason I do that is because I'm going to be reading out of bounds in memory. At one point, I might read the marker value, which I have here. So this very, very small float is actually something that's represented in memory as 100001337. So we can see 1337 is the index. 1 is the length of the segment, because we created a segment with only one element. And now what I'm doing is I'm using my array, which I can access out of bounds from index 4000 in a for loop until I find this marker value. So basically I'm banking on the fact that I have my segment, which I can access out of bounds, reading the memory that's past it, and at some point in that memory there will be the segment of my second array. Now, the cool thing here for that particular trigger is we have a way to know whether we located the segment, which is the if statement that you see, the very last line in green. So if that equality succeeds, we basically now know the relative distance from the first array to the second array segment. And now basically all we need to do the setup once, make sure those objects are global so they live in memory throughout the execution of the script. And now all I can do now in blue is on my second array, I assign the object I want to leak, and since I know the relative distance from my first array to the second array, which I can access out of bounds, just read at that particular index here. So let's see what I have written here. I hope I was clear enough. But yeah, we have basically, this gives us our address of primitive. Now the fake obj primitive, once again, let's formalize it a bit. So given an address A as a number, fake obj of A should return to you a handle to a JavaScript object at that arbitrary memory location. What I mean by that is that if you call fake obj with 41414141, you should have a JavaScript object that you can use in JavaScript, which is supposed to be located at 414141. So as soon as you use it, of course, you're going to crash because it's not a valid object, but that's what this primitive is for. The idea here is we're going to do it the other way around. We're going to be accessing from an object array for which if the value is not tagged, that means it's a pointer, into a double array where we can basically assign values untagged and try to reliably access from an object array into the double array so that it treats that value, which we'll be able to control, as a pointer value. So the trigger for that here is a bit shorter. I have highlighted the re-event part, so as I said, it's the other way around. In red, we have the out-of-bound access. In green, you basically have everything that's related to the object array. So here we can see in the loop, this time I don't declare it with 1.1, I declare it with an empty object, which makes it directly the most generic array type. And I create a second array, which is a double array in blue. And, once again, I triggered the corruption. The bad thing here is that since like previously with address-off, we were reading double values, so we were able to basically verify and know the distance for sure. Here we just have to, make our best, and because we will have no way to know the relative distance, so that's why in red you can see that I access at index 4000 plus 20, hard-coded. In my experience, it worked every time, but yeah, maybe the segment was further and you're actually going to crash, but that wasn't the case in my experience. So yeah, basically the same thing as before for address-off, but the other way around. So, cool thing, now we can test the two primitives with these two lines of code. We create an object, and if we call fake object on the result of address-off of that object, we should end up with the exact same object as before. So, once again, that's what I mean by ease of exploitation and why JavaScript is super interesting as a target, is that we have all these things that a scripting language gives us to basically verify that the exploit is working as intended every step of the way. So, we're done now, right? Well, no. All we did was we turned a relative out-of-bound access into address-off and fake obj primitives, and now we need to build the read-write primitives from there. I already explained how to do that in details in my stick presentation, so we're not going to go through it here, and I believe we've seen enough code. In a nutshell, what we do, we use fake obj and address-off, so our two primitives, to fake what is a typed array. So typed array in JavaScript, they gives us a way to write and read unboxed memory. We fake it in such a way that we can control the buffer pointer, and by basically using this typed array, we can use it as a memory controller and read and write primitive. If you're interested in that particular part, I recommend checking out the presentation I give at Stick, which is also online. So now, we're going to be jumping that part. We assume that we have read-write in the renderer process, and still we're very far from being done. What's next? We need to get the control of the instruction pointer in the presence of control flow guard. So there's no return flow guard anymore, and there's no Intel CET, so the shadow stack hardware mechanism yet at the moment. So it's relatively easy to just overwrite a return address on the stack. Then basically in Edge we have to do full ROP. You can't just do a small ROP chain to map shellcode, because there's something called ACG, arbitrary code guard, that will just straight up prevent you from doing that at the OS level. But it's just a one-time cost to write a ROP framework where you can plug your read and write primitive, which is basically what the Pwn.js library did when they released it. And after all of that, we need to launch the sandbox escape, which is all we've seen. And again, this time maybe in the kernel, maybe in another service, you have to find a bug, exploit it, whatever, yada, yada, yada. And yeah, basically after you've done all of that, you've done your chain, and you can rest. So that's about it for the exploitation journey and the attacker's perspective. Now I wanted to close by talking a bit about the defender's perspective. So one disclaimer, it's not my field of work. So please take it with a grain of salt. It's only my perspective as someone that's on the other side of the fence. There are two broad philosophies I feel I can talk about a bit, which are killing bugs and make exploitation impossible. And one I cannot talk about, which people always ask, but which is form of verification. So I won't talk about that because it's not my field, so I won't pretend like I know anything in there. So the first philosophy, killing bugs. The nice thing with that is that vendors can get outside help, so bounty programs. These can and should be improved a lot, and I will leave it at that. If you want to discuss more in details about it, feel free to come to me. And then there's like Project Zero-like help, and what I mean by that is that vendor teams that are focused on finding vulnerabilities. I believe the problem here now is that Project Zero is kind of the only team that's doing that for other vendors, and then you have Chinese teams that report bugs like crazy, but it's kind of limited, and all the vendors have not, I feel like, done the same kind of approach that Google did. But the counterpart of getting outside the help is that it has to be met with internal effort, because there's only so much we control from the outside. I believe the sad truth is that vendors have not really succeeded, and that's putting it very nicely, at doing variant analysis themselves. And also, as an outside researcher, you still get the chance of being antagonized, or sometimes you have like really weird interactions with like, people from bounty program, which is one thing that, that might turn off people from like, helping vendors. Talking about the vendors side now, what can be done? So continuous auditing. I believe this is something that vendors should do. It's also being done by the outside world. Continuous fuzzing. I believe vendors are the ones that should be doing that the most, because, of course, what's in product, they work on the new thing and then they do a release, and you have that whole span of time where you can catch a bug before it ever hits the actual product and the general population, which is where continuous fuzzing should be done. Two main things that where improvement can be made. Write better fuzzers, so that's super generic, but I believe fuzzers can always be improved, and also make fuzzing generically more effective. And here, that's the work that has to be done with instrumentation such as like ASAN, page heap, kernel ASAN, that sort of stuff. Still, at the end of the day, you have some components that are just like inherently harder than others to fuzz and look at. That's the case of JIT compilers, for example. And also one thing that's getting a bit of traction, which is memory safe programming, which I call the let's use Rust everywhere approach, which I believe have some merits, but yeah, you're not just going to rewrite Windows from scratch in Rust, just like that. Second approach, making exploitation harder. One realization is that if you have a bug, but it's it's formally proved that it's impossible to exploit it, then it's basically equivalent to having no more bugs. That particular part, it's much harder to get outside help, and there's also no incentive to do so as an independent researcher or whatever. And there are various areas where work can be done. So you have software-based mitigations. So it's usually cheap to implement, but it's usually as cheap to bypass. And as soon as a bypass is publicly available, then it's basically the same as not having that mitigation in the first place, which was the case with GigaCage in WebKit, for example, in JavaScript core, which is the JavaScript engine of Safari and WebKit. But still, some of them are really good. So once again, talking about WebKit, they have this thing called ISO-heap that kind of, in one go narrowed a good bunch of the DOM attack surface there. So I believe that's an example of a good mitigation, which is software-based. Then you have compiler-based mitigation, so things like control flow guard, which is Microsoft implementation of CFI, so control flow integrity, structure initialization, so I know Microsoft has done something there as well recently. Here, outside the help is possible if you have access to the compiler, which might or might not be the case, but usually these mitigations, they always imply some kind of performance trade-off. So the vendor has to take the decision. So you, as an independent researcher, you can say, look, I have this thing, but I don't know if you can come up with one of these compiler-based mitigation that has like a zero performance trade-off. So like the vendor will have the final word in terms of whether it makes it into the compiler or not. OS-based stuff like ACG, CIG, so which are Windows stuff. So harden, things to basically harden security that are done at the OS level. I wrote can be hard to implement and requires dedication to what platform. What I mean by that is that if you want as an outsider to help, doing stuff at the OS level, so if you take the case of Windows, you don't have access to the OS, so you're very limited from the start. If you take Linux, which is open source, you can do stuff, but it requires like deep expertise of the platform, but that's the whole business model of the GRSec and the PAX team. But it seems to work for them. So I mean, it's doable, but it's hard, and it's not something that everybody can do. And then the final one, which is hardware-based, so pointer authentication code on latest iOS chips, memory tagging, which is coming soon, Intel CET, so the shadow stack mechanism. And as attackers, definitely what scares us the most. And outside help here is virtually impossible. And once again, the problem here is that it's dependent on how widely distributed it is, because even if mem tagging comes next year, it's going to only be on the latest models of iPhones, for example, and you're still going to have like a huge part of the population that has like, iPhones where that mechanism is not there because it's at the hardware level, so you can't just like, do an update or whatever. Which is it for the defender's perspective. So in conclusion, I'd say that targets are objectively becoming safer. Even in my short time span as a, doing full-time vulnerability researcher, I've seen the change, at least for the JIT compilers and JavaScript engines. But also attackers are also objectively getting smarter at the same time, because people that have been attacking your target 2 years ago are the same ones that are doing it today. So, they became also smarter in the meantime. Focus, I'd say, is still on the complex components. So if you take the JIT, that's the most complex component for JavaScript engine. I'd say that's where like all the focus is right now. And, where lies complexity lies bugs, basically. And finally, I'd say the amount of work per bug still tends to be much higher in my experience these days. And once again, I've seen the evolution in like the span of like 18 months. From like 18 months ago, you could maybe like spend half a morning and you were done. Now these days, maybe you have to spend 3 weeks, and you might be done, might not be done. It depends. And yeah, that's it for me. I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and feel free to ask questions.
Thank you, Bruno. So we're a little bit ahead of time, so we got plenty of time to take questions, if there aren't any. Up.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. Quick question. So Chakra is out normally from Edge, so it should be moved to V8. I don't know if you confirm it. Yeah. And my question being it is, did you look at V8 and Turbofan? Because I know there is a JIT spray also problem. I look at it, but it's also a bit complex what you have done, and it's a great work. Thank you.
Yeah, so Chakra, well, what they call basically Edge HTML, which is the old implementation of Edge as it is right now, is on its way out, but it's still the default these days. I believe the first release of like the new Edge Chromium-based browser will be in January, but I don't believe it will be directly the default. So yeah, it's on its way out. I did look at V8. It's much harder in terms of security, because like it has gotten a lot of scrutiny, and Google is really good at what I said, which is doing like the continuous fuzzing and auditing cycle. So like every now and then they introduce a new bug, but usually it dies like 2 weeks later or something. So yeah, I'd say so far in terms of security, like it's much harder. But once again, this is not my area of expertise, and I believe if you want to find bugs in JavaScript engine these days, you have like there's a lot of initial investment to like focus, understand the code base, and that's not something I've done with V8 as opposed to Chakra.
Any other question?
Hi. Could you explain the difference you made between having better fuzzers and making fuzzing more effective?
Yeah, so what I mean by that is making fuzzing more effective is something that I'd say is independent of like the target you're fuzzing. I don't know if I'm clear enough, but if you take the case of ASAN, so address sanitizer, the concept applies to whatever you're fuzzing, because you're trying to detect generic classes of bugs, so heap buffer overflows, stack overflows, etc., etc. So then that mechanism can be applied to a variety of targets. What I mean by writing a better fuzzer is for like that particular target, writing a fuzzer that's more effective, and that was kind of what everybody was trying to do, at least last year, in terms of fuzzing JavaScript. Fuzzing JavaScript was like, it's still not a solved problem, but there was basically nothing out there until Sam released Fuzzily, which you might have heard about. which can kind of change the dynamic of the field here. But that's basically what I mean. You need someone to come up with an idea which might be specific to a particular field, which is JavaScript fuzzing, or specific to a particular target, or whatnot.
Thank you, Bruno. A good presentation. Just a quick question for you. How much time did it take you to write the full chain from finding the bug to getting something quite reliable?
I think it was 5 days full of work, like maybe 60, 70 hours or something. Just like finding actually, like it was more like 4 days of finding that I could override the segment, because I lost a lot of time, trying to get like the vtable corruption and everything, see if I could get something there. And then I looked at the target, and after I had the segment, probably like 20 hours, I'd say.
Any other question? I've got a non-technical question for you. We got a couple of students who basically follow the same studies that you did a couple of years ago. What would be your advice if they want to make a career and if they want to make a living from security research?
So I think first off, you have to be like really honest with yourself. If you start doing that, most likely you're not going to make any money for a period of time. Luckily for me, I had someone in the room that supported me financially for like 8 months, while I was making a grand total of €0 per month for 8 months straight. Huge time investment. Like the initial time investment is what really will be painful, because like that period where you set out to try to find a first bug and you're not going to find anything for a long time can be super demoralizing, but you have to keep at it. And I'd say do something that you enjoy, because you're going to be working on your own. You basically have to force yourself to work. Sometimes, it's not easy if you have the luxury of slacking off. And yeah, I'd say just find a target that you have interest in. Read everything that's available online. So it can be tempting, or I'm just going to read the code by myself, and you should do that. But you also have a lot of people that, published resources, and you should process that, reread it 10, 100 times. I'd start with the Project Zero bug tracker, because usually it's super condensed. So they have one page is one bug, where you have the analysis of the bug, and you have maybe the exploit code that's available for it. So depending on whether or not they publish something that's related to what you want to audit, then that's a good target. But also I'm a bit biased in that I do browsers, so it's a very specific niche of the whole bounty world. If you think about things like HackerOne, which are more related to web hacking, then I say that general principles still apply. You need to be a good web security specialist, but I have no real advices there, because that's not something I do.
Okay, merci. So we're going to be thanking again Bruno for his talk.